Good morning, Ms. Freeman.
Good morning.
Now, as you're aware, and of course you've given evidence to the inquiry before, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McIntosh. But first, I understand you're prepared to take the oath.
I am.
Sitting where you are, could I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Ms. Freeman. Now, your evidence is scheduled for the day. Whether it takes the full day or not, I'm not sure. We will take a coffee break at about 11:30 and take lunch at 1 o'clock for about an hour. But if at any stage you want to take a break, just tell me and we can take a break.
Thank you.
Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you. Ms. Freeman, before I ask you any questions, I should just say there was a technical issue with the YouTube feed last night. In case any of those watching online are wondering why they couldn't see yesterday's evidence, we've resolved that now. I was going to say that before you came in. Can I ask your full name?
Jeane Freeman.
And what's your current occupation?
So I am part-time at the University of Glasgow as Dean of Strategic Community Engagement and Economic Development.
Thank you. And you previously gave evidence at this inquiry on the 12th of March last year.
I did.
Thank you for returning on this final day of evidence in the Glasgow leg of the hearing. We obviously have two statements for you from the Edinburgh leg, a principal statement and a supplementary statement. Are you willing to adopt this third additional statement as part of your evidence?
With one correction, if I may.
Could you tell me which paragraph it relates to?
It relates to paragraph 15.
Which is on page 99 of the hearing bundle. This relates to the responsibility of chief executives.
Yes, it's simply to clarify what I meant. It's a little misleading as you read it just now, where I say that Health Board chief executives are accountable to the GGHSC stroke chief executive of NHS Scotland. The actual fact is that a Health Board chief executive is accountable to their employing authority, which will be their Health Board, but they are appointed as accountable officer by the chief executive of NHS Scotland and are accountable to that person for that role.
As accountable officer?
As accountable officer.
Well, with that clarification, are you willing to adopt?
I am.
Now, thank you. Now, actually, my first question was about that from a slightly different perspective. If we stay with paragraph 15, you mention the role of the Director General as Chief Executive NHS Scotland. It appears on her headed paper, and there's also a Chief Operating Officer of NHS Scotland within the Directorate. I wondered whether these titles might, to some degree, overstate the amount of day-to-day control that both of those office holders can exert over the operations of the parts of the health service that are run by local health boards. I wonder what you think of that.
Excuse me, I don't think they overstate the degree of control. I think, for example, the Chief Operating Officer, as perhaps we will see subsequently in relation to NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, has a direct responsibility for ensuring that the operation of individual health boards is designed and delivered in such a way that it meets the objectives of the Scottish Government, who has set out what objectives the NHS in Scotland need to meet in any particular given period. And the combination of the role of Director General for Health and Social Care with NHS Scotland Chief Executive is, I think, designed to ensure that the two are complementary. So we don't have a separation between the head, if you like, of the policy area of health in Scottish Government and the day-to-day challenges and operation of the NHS in Scotland. Now, there is a debate, there's always been a debate inside Scottish Government as to whether those roles should be separated or should remain combined. And I think that remains a live debate. But as of now, they are combined.
I suppose the reason I was asking the question is not because of any thought that they should be separated, but simply because in the sample of one, i.e. one health board, that this leg of the inquiry has dealt with, one sometimes gets the impression from chief executives, and not all of them we've spoken to, but two of them anyway, that there's a level of autonomy in the operations of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, which is not only justified in policy terms, but is right and proper in the way the world is set up. And we obviously will discuss situations and hypothetical future situations where a Scottish government might wish things to be done a certain way. You don't, in this sample of one doesn't always get the impression that what the Scottish government wants necessarily happens in a health board. And so what I'm suggesting is there's a lack of transparency in the job title.
So I completely understand your question, and I understand what has led you to ask that. And it is true that there is a tension where some of our health boards do believe that they are autonomous of Scottish Government. And I think that in part arises from the 1978 Act and the statutory basis on which our health boards are formed and their role as the employing authority. However, my view is and always has been, and when I was the Health Secretary, our boards were very clear on this, that health boards were not autonomous of Scottish Government. Their funding came from Scottish Government in order to meet the objective set. Where there is, if you like, autonomy and discretion, quite rightly, in individual health boards, is how they apply the requirement to meet those objectives to local circumstances. So, for example, I would expect that the delivery routes in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde will differ in some important ways from NHS Highland to take account of the geography, perhaps the different demographics between different health boards, so that the services are tailored to meet the needs of a local population. But I don't accept that a cohort of patients, for example, who have cancer of any particular type between Aberdeen and Glasgow is sufficiently distinct for there to be distinct approaches to how they are treated.
Thank you. I wonder if we can, within this conversation, focus down on capital procurement. And you discussed that in the previous paragraph on page 99. And you refer back to evidence you've previously given on the role of Scottish Government in the procurement of large-scale hospital building projects. And I think that's in columns 7 or 8 or thereabouts in your transcript from last year. And then you sort of summarise your position here in the rest of this paragraph. We've obviously had a different scenario in Glasgow from that faced by Lothian Health and you in 2019 in respect of the Edinburgh Hospital. And we've heard about the creation of NHS Assure, and I'll come back to that in detail later on.
Yeah.
I'm keen to explore with you the extent to which the government, in the form of either the Cabinet Secretary or the Director General, should take responsibility for ensuring that these large multi-hundreds of £1 million procurement projects, and this I suppose is the biggest, comply with things like HI Scribe, Scottish Technical Memorandums, and also don't end up signing contracts that don't actually deliver their stated employers' requirements. And effectively, what level should the Scottish Government take a direct interest to ensure that the public interest as the funder is protected in the really big project?
So I think Scottish Government should do that. I do not agree with the arm's length approach that has been taken on procurement. So you see it in this particular instance. To a degree, we saw something similar with the hospital in NHS Lothian. Because at the end of the day, the public is perfectly entitled to hold the government to account when building projects go wrong. Either they're delayed, or they go over their budget, or there are other more or equally substantive mistakes in their design and construction. That is not the position that I was in as Cabinet Secretary. And to a large extent, that view that I'm now expressing to you underpinned both my experience with both those hospitals, but also my desire to see the creation of something which has now become NHS Assure.
Thank you. Well, what I was proposing to do now is to start at the beginning and go through and, as it were, pick up NHS Assure when we get to it in the natural order of events. I want to start with your awareness of issues with the Queen Elizabeth, and you start that paragraph 18 of your statement, but actually that's on page 101. And I think your position is relatively clear, but effectively does it amount to this, that when you became Cabinet Secretary, you had no real engagement with the Queen Elizabeth New Southern General Hospital at all?
No, I hadn't had. I had had some engagement with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde in a pre my period of being an elected politician.
Yeah.
When I was chair of NHS Golden Jubilee. But I had no direct involvement in anything, or no direct knowledge of any of the issues around the Queen Elizabeth.
Well, the reason I've been asked, well, let's look at the briefing note that you received on the 27th of July 2018. So that's bundle 52, volume 4, document 4, page 18. In fact, it starts at page 19. Do you remember receiving this briefing note?
I do.
Yes. Having read that briefing note for that first time, that's July 18, what was your initial reaction to what was going on at the Queen Elizabeth?
So my initial reaction, as I recall it, was to begin to understand some of the detail of the infection incidences that were challenging Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and to look for a conversation with Professor McQueen to get behind some of that, and to have a concern about the cumulative impact of those infections and her assessment of the board's response.
And to what extent is your focus at this point on infections as opposed to infrastructure?
It's on infections.
It's on infections. And so do we see, for example, within this briefing, the explanation that the what was previously the CNO's algorithm and then the framework for the CNO has been engaged by this point?
Yes.
Yes. Now, in the statement, if we go on to paragraph 19, we asked you, and we to be fair, we kept asking you throughout the questionnaire that we sent you, when you knew certain things about the ventilation. And I was thinking about a way of helping you to find out when you might have learned things. I think there's an element of lack of certainty in your statement, which may be the passage of time. So if we just recap where we are at this point in the hospital. So this is July 18. Ward 4B, the adult BMT unit, has returned to the hospital. It returned before you took office. Ward 2A remains in use. And I'm not going to ask you about the somewhat diffuse issue of isolation rooms. I figured that's... And the other issue is general ventilation across the general wards. Now, if we try and put an end to this period, when you authorize the independent review,
Yes.
at the moment you authorize the independent review, do you then know that there are issues with the ventilation system?
Can you remind me of the date when I...
That would be 22nd of January
2019.
2019.
2019. So yes, at that point I do know
Right.
about
So
ventilation issues.
with that sort of end point in mind, what I want to do is to sort of step through the events. In your evidence on the 12th of March last year, and it's column 42, you explained that you thought you knew by the end of 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and there's an HPS S-bar about ventilation in Ward 2A that precedes your appointment. So that is Bundle 3, Document 8, page 62. And I'm assuming that you wouldn't have seen this.
No.
No, because at one level it's sort of below the level that is briefed to ministers.
Yes.
So if we then step forward to the moment of the decant decision in September of 2018, can I take it that you were being briefed? I think you've had evidence that you were being briefed about this decant decision as it was being made.
Yes, I was.
Would you have known about the ventilation standards in Ward 2A by the time of the decant?
I don't believe I did. From memory, my recollection is that I understood the decant to be about water.
Because one of the questions that has been suggested I ask you is, given that the patients from Ward 2A moved to Ward 6A in the adult hospital, which had, for the Queen Elizabeth, its standard ventilation, which isn't compliant with SHGMO 301, were you aware at the time of decant that this was a move from a ward that to some extent was trying to provide specialist ventilation to one that wasn't?
No, I wasn't. And I think it is fair to say, with hindsight, I wish I had been. I assumed, and the assumption was wrong on my part, assumptions that I learned through the experience with Greater Glasgow and Clyde and with the Lothian Hospital that were mistaken and should be challenged by me, that boards were meeting the necessary standards. So I assumed that matters to do with ventilation and infection prevention and control were standard practice and being met by boards.
And
that clearly was not the case.
Well, I think, so again, in an effort to help you try and nail this down a bit, it occurs to me I might put to you a number of different ways you could have found out before the independent review was instructed. You could have been briefed directly by your civil service team. You could have received something from the health board that told you of this. Maybe from Professor Steele, who's the director of estates at this point. You could have heard from a constituency member of parliament. You could have heard from the media. And it occurs to me you could have heard from a whistleblower who isn't the ones we know about because they don't contact you till January. Does that help you in any way recollect how it was that you learnt in the run-up to 22nd January that there was an issue with the general ventilation across the hospital?
It doesn't particularly, I'm afraid, but what I do recall is I don't believe that my officials knew that the ventilation standards were not met. And I think it is a number of other events that drew that to their attention. Possibly the DMA Canyon report, when that was revealed, and certainly the whistleblowers raised it with me.
So the whistleblowers don't contact you until after the independent review is announced. And therefore, maybe we have to look in the HFS work that's going on and how they might have fed to you. And we can continue to look at written material with that in mind. Yep. I want to move on to a series of questions that I've been asked to put to you. Clearly, from the independent review onwards, you begin to take direct steps, and we'll come back to what they are. But I've been asked to put to you that prior to the end of 2019, were there mechanisms in place for the Scottish Government to assure itself that commissioning and validation and processes like HI Ascribe were being carried out in connection with NHS Scotland building project.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Prior to the end of 18.
Prior to the end of 18?
Yes. So before the independent review has been instructed, were there systems in place by which the Scottish Government could satisfy itself that individual health boards were properly commissioning new facilities in compliance with HI Scribe and the relevant technical memorandums? Or was it, as you just seem to have just implied, somewhat a system of trust?
I think it was a system of trust to a significant extent. There was, excuse me, I think an assumption that board chief executives would take responsibility in leading those projects, any build project, to ensure that the design required the build to meet relevant standards. And I think there was an assumption that anything that was going wrong, that the information would come from a health board to Scottish Government officials, and that would then trigger, for example, the involvement of the Chief Nursing Officer's office if it was about infection prevention and control, or any of the other agencies with their support.
You, at the beginning of your evidence today, we discussed the role of the Chief Executive and Chief Operating Officer of NHS Scotland, and you talked about your belief that the public would expect that the government does take responsibility for the spending on the larger projects, in paraphrase. Had I asked you that question, assuming you would have not been surprised if I'd done that, at the end of 2018, how would you have answered it back then?
I think I would have answered it exactly the same way.
I've been asked to put this to you. How would you respond to this suggestion that it might be seen as a failure of oversight and scrutiny at the end of 2018 by the Scottish Government to have a system that to some degree or to greater degree relies on trust in this area?
I'm not sure that I think it would be fair to say it is a failure of oversight and scrutiny. I think it is naive of government not to have that situation, to maintain that situation. But I'm also conscious that there has been, on occasion, criticism of my approach, which is to suggest that it is overly centralist. But I do strongly hold the view that if government is to be held accountable, as it rightly is, for such matters, then government should exercise more oversight and scrutiny than it has done in the past.
This is probably an impossible question to answer, but where do you think the public thinks the accountability lies for £100 million projects? What institutions does it look to really to make sure the money is spent wisely?
I think it looks to both the individual institution that is overseeing whatever that build is, but I think it also looks to government. And I think the public in Scotland is much more sophisticated in its understanding than we often give it credit for. So it looks to, in this instance, Greater Glasgow and Clyde, but it also looks to government to say, why did you not stop that? Why did you not intervene to improve that?
And how do you feel the role of those elected to public office who are out with the government and individual institutions? What role does the Parliament play in this accountability conversation we've just been having?
So Parliament's role is to hold government to account. And I think in this particular situation, and indeed in the Lothian one, I think it is possible to see how individual MSPs from all parties sought to question me and demand from me what I was doing and to express a view as to whether or not they thought that was good enough.
Given that the MSPs were holding you to account, can you help us about where the people are who would be holding NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde to account are?
Well, that was my role.
So you feel there's a sort of a step through. So the Parliament is holding you to account, you hold the Health Board to account.
Yes.
What about the role of the non-executive board members? Because there's an awful lot of them.
So I think in the normal operation of a health board, it is the role of the board to hold the chief executive and its executive members, i.e. the various directors, to account for the work that they are doing in a way that is both supportive and challenging. I think the role of non-exec members on a board is to look for evidence, to question, and to pursue issues if they are not satisfied. That is what I believe their job to be. That is what I took to be my job when I was a non-executive member of a health board. I think it is entirely possible to undertake that role in a way that is supportive and challenging. And that's what I expect from non-executive members of boards. I don't accept a position which says I was assured that if you did not ask questions and seek the evidence to back the assurance. That's not a criticism of the individual assuring you. That is making sure that you can be assured because you have seen the evidence that they are working from.
You opened that question with a reference to day-to-day matters.
Yeah.
Were you seeking to draw some sort of contrast between day-to-day matters and exceptional matters like large procurement, or have I misread that?
Not at all.
No.
Not at all.
What I wanted to do now was to move to your decision to appoint the independent review. Now, the independent review we have in Bundle 27, Volume 9, Document 11, at page 160. 160. Because we have your terms of reference at the foot of the page quoted by the authors. To establish whether design, build, commissioning and maintenance of the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, Royal Hospital Children has an adverse impact on the risk of healthcare associated infections and whether there is a wider learning for NHS Scotland. Now, you covered this in some considerable detail last March, and we find that in your previous statement, paragraph 72. I wanted just to take one particular question and expand it. So if we look at the review and go to page 169 at paragraph 1.66, there's a discussion of documents. Now, one of the things that this inquiry has noticed is that we had access to more documents than the independent review.
Mm-hmm.
And that has included the material that has enabled us to drill down and find out when the decision, if not why the decision, was made to accept ventilation at 40 litres a second for each of the 1,300 rooms rather than 6 air changes an hour. Now, it doesn't appear that information was available to independent review. Mm-hmm. And it may be that paragraph 1.6.6 is where we see why, because they state a significant number of these documents are not in the public domain, are now deemed to be commercially confidential and sensitive due to ongoing illegal action between GDC and its former contractors. Several of the documents emerged or were completed at later stages of the review. We continue to correspond and gather evidence from individuals and organisations until a late stage of our review to ensure we can present a fair, accurate and complete an account as possible. Now, I'm sure they tried to present a complete account as possible, but did you expect that issues of confidentiality associated with the legal action to prevent the independent review having access to these logs and email exchanges around the final days before contract close in 2009?
No, I didn't. I did expect those documents to be made available to the co-chairs of the independent review, because I had every confidence that they were perfectly able to maintain confidentiality and understand sensitivity. But from memory, Greater Glasgow and Clyde's view was, because there was legal action underway, that it was not possible to disclose those documents to the review.
And how would you respond to the suggestion that whilst there will be much in the independent review that is of value because it wasn't just looking at this issue, a failure to understand how it was, if not why it was, that this decision was made, rather causes a gap at the heart of the conclusions of the review?
I think that's fair, and I think the co-chairs would agree with you.
I've also been asked to put to you something in your statement. So if you go to paragraph, I think it's 73 of your statement, because at one point we decided not to ask the questions in chronological order, for which I apologise. Paragraph 73, it's page 124. We asked you, and conscious that you've already given evidence about this, we asked you to consider the independent review had sufficient authority to carry out its work. And you say in the third sentence, it dealt with the concerns it was asked to address, design, procurement, and build. I need to put it to you that it was also asked to consider the possibility of adverse impact of infections. And that might just be an oversight on your part in the statement. At the point you instructed the independent review, you of course hadn't heard from Dr. Redding and Dr. Peters, if I understand correctly. Is that as I understand it?
Yeah.
So let's look at your interactions with those. Well, again, you've covered those in your Edinburgh supplementary statement in some detail, but let's go to page 102 of the current statement. And in fact, it starts at page 100. Well, it's 102, and it's paragraph 21. And you describe the detail of the interactions there, and you've covered them in considerably more detail in Edinburgh 3 statement, and indeed in evidence. But I want just to clarify for absolute certainty when you deal with each of them, as it were. So you have no contact with Dr. Inkster before December, or possibly September of 2009, when you first meet her.
Sorry?
You know, no contact with Dr. Inkster until September, or till December of 2019.
That's correct.
Yes. But your first contact with Dr. Peters is the day after the independent review has been announced. She contacts your office, or thereabouts.
I'm not quite sure that's right. The first contact with Dr. Peters and Dr. Redding comes at the request of Anna Sarwar to me.
Would that have been before the independent review was announced?
It would be at the time of the independent review. Whether it was immediately before it was announced or after it was announced, I can't recall.
Presumably it took a few weeks to get the independent review set up and chairs found.
It did. I think from memory, I announced that there will be one. And then at that point, we don't have who the chair is going to be, and as subsequently it becomes co-chairs. But Anna's had contacted me informally and asked me to meet Dr. Peters and Dr. Redding. And as I say in my statement, I did do that. It was an entirely informal meeting.
Yes, and this is the one you describe in 22 and 23.
Yes.
And to what extent you may not be able to be sure about this, the extent to which that first conversation, inform the decision to set up the independent review, or was it in effect already something you decided to do?
No, it was already in train. The setting up of the independent review was already in my mind and in train, because we were seeing a number of instances of infection higher than would be expected in a hospital of that type, treating patient cohorts of that type. And we did not seem to be getting to the bottom of why is this happening. That was the point of the independent review. It was set up not on a statutory basis. It then encountered at least one of the major problems you've highlighted, not being able to access documents. And in part, that experience is what led to my decision to set up this public inquiry on a statutory basis. So we can't get into arguments about whether documents can be released or not released.
If we think back to the decision to set up the independent review, just to keep the story, as it were, flowing in a sort of narrative way, always look back at your previous evidence. That awareness of infections is both the water incident that had started before you arrived and what you were briefed about in April in that briefing note we just looked at. But that also included the Cryptococcus cases over December, January of 1819, or had the idea actually come to you before the first Cryptococcus cases were drawn to your attention?
There were also, from memory, bloodborne infections as well before that. So we had the issues around water, we had bloodborne infections, and it was in my mind that we needed to find out what was wrong here, because we were also seeing high levels of compliance in practice by clinical and nursing staff. So it seemed that there may be something wrong with the building. And then we have the Cryptococcus incident.
Now, you obviously meet Dr. Redding and Dr. Peters with Mr. Sarwar. You then have the independent review announced. Dr. Peters gets in touch. We have emails. We can read those. Before I move on to, I'll park that question and come back to it. That's probably better to do it later. I want to think about the HIS inspection.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we go to your statement over the page on page 103, you explain your recollection of the issues raised by Dr. Peter and Dr. Inkster, including in respect of water testing results and the sign-off of HIS scribes. We've heard their evidence about that. And then there's discussion about the issue of the ventilation systems in 2A, 4B, 4C, and infectious diseases. Now, I appreciate that a lot of time has passed, but it would be quite interesting in a way that couldn't be asked last year to understand from you how much of what you were being told by the whistleblowers was actually news to you in its entirety, because I'm sure they were giving you extra detail and stuff you'd already heard about. But was there anything they were telling you that was genuinely totally new to you?
So the most substantive thing they were telling me that was genuinely new was how persistently and for how long they had been raising concerns, which they felt very strongly had been ignored, not listened to, and that they had felt in some way penalised and dismissed for persistently raising those concerns within the board. The extent of that and the degree of that was new to me. It resonated with other issues in other boards around the whole culture of openness and transparency and people being able to raise concerns and have them treated seriously and not feel that they would in some way be punished for having done so. But of course, there's always more than one perspective to any particular situation. And that is why, although I undoubtedly took the issues that they raised with me seriously, I then asked the CNO to take matters on and see, in her view, how much of the concerns that were being raised could be corroborated and evidenced, if you like, because both the doctors were perfectly understandably very engaged and very concerned, both professionally and personally, in this situation, and individually impacted by what the experience they'd had. So you have to then take a step back and say, I take all of that absolutely seriously, and I don't doubt what you are telling me, or that you are telling me this sincerely, but we need to now look and see how much of this is actually the case.
Thank you. I want to just try and explore that in a number of different ways. So you mentioned different perspectives. So if we take that you've explained that some point in January is when you're hearing this, and that you're not really being told about new things that are live at that point, but being told about the length of time things have been raised. You think back to the conversation.
Could I just confirm? I'm sure Councillor is absolutely right. What I've taken from your answer so far, Ms. Freeman, that you were not necessarily being given information about the, I can describe it as the history of the building or the state of the building that you had previously been unaware of.
That's true. I wasn't. I understood that there were, obviously I understood that there were concerns around the water supply and its safety, and its whether or not it had a link to infection, bloodborne infections. So was there something wrong with this building? But what I was being told that was new was that these concerns had been raised for a number of years prior to them being raised with me. And of course, doctors Peters and Redding were also explaining what they perceived as their inability to get information and data that they believed was necessary for them to do their job.
Thank you.
So if we think about prior to the appointment of the independent review, had you had meetings yourself with personnel from NHS Greater Glasgow?
I think I certainly had a board meeting. I attended a board meeting. I'd also had in January, I think I referred to it in my statement, the meeting with the chief executive, the chair, the medical director, yes, the head of estates. That was around, in particular, it was triggered by the pigeon dropping incident, but it covered more than that. It covered the other areas of infection as well.
In that meeting, or indeed any other interactions that you personally had with GDC officials, had you been given by them any indication that these issues had been raised internally within the health board over the previous 3.5, 4 years?
No.
No. Secondly, just to connect this, you mentioned your awareness about issues of culture in the health. I noticed that the Sturrock review was instructed in November 2018. It's a different health board. I appreciate that. You've obviously instructed the Sturrock review for NHS Highland.
Yep.
Did you give any thought? Did you intend the independent review to get into the same territory as Mr. Sturrock had done, or to stay firmly on procurement and infection link, as it seems to have, to a greater degree, done?
Yes, no, I didn't intend it to get into the territory that Mr. Stark had done, although it was in my mind over the coming period from kind of January onwards that we might need another version of the Stark Review. The Stark Review was triggered because we had a group of whistleblowers, and as you know, in NHS Highland, who had been consistently raising issues of concern from their professional backgrounds and consistently being ignored and dismissed by senior members of the executive team and the board, to the point where they went public on that matter. I have a really strong view that people who work in our health service do so because they want to provide the best possible service that they can to the public they serve, whatever their job is, whether they are housekeepers or porters or senior clinicians. And so when they raise concerns, they deserve the respect of being heard and those concerns treated properly. When they get to a point where they blow the whistle, then they have been pushed to that point by not being heard and not being listened to. And they absolutely should be. I don't think any organisation is beyond criticism and indeed can learn a great deal from concerns and criticism. So of course the NHS Highland situation was in my mind as I then hear from Dr. Peters and Reading.
And so, might it well be that the act you took was to instruct or ask the Chief Nursing Officer to instruct at her recommendation the HIS inspection that then took place?
Yes.
Now, let us just connect things together because it's somewhat useful to us in the inquiry. So we make sure we're looking at the right report. So bundle 18, volume 2, document 128, page 1490. And so, from as far as you can recollect, would this be the result of the unannounced inspection that you'd ordered?
Yes.
I'm assuming you would have read this report at the time.
Yes.
If we go to page 1494, there's a list of things that are the inspection focus. And if we go to the next page, so we go back 2 pages, I'm just on the wrong page. There we are. One of the issues that we have evidence from Dr. Inkster, and she in her statement, paragraph 739, says the inspection team told her they were going to ask about culture, and that was a novelty, I think, to them. To any extent did your instructions through the CNO encourage HIS to look at culture?
Yes, it did.
Right. Did you give HIS instructions of anybody to speak to?
No, I wanted them to carry out the inspection in the manner in which they chose. So not particularly go and speak to this person or that person, because that potentially skews the work they do. They are professional in what they do, and they should be free to get on and do that job.
So the fact that it happened to be Dr. Inkster who was in the offices that day is pure serendipity?
But it certainly was not something that I asked for or arranged.
To what extent was the issues that you gave to the Chief Nursing Officer or discussed with her and developed with her for the inspection effectively an attempt to check to some degree that there is an alternative, that there is a third-party verification of what you're being told by Dr. Peters and Dr. Reading?
To a degree, I think from memory, although I can't be certain of this, in speaking to Professor McQueen, one of the areas that about what Dr. Peters and Dr. Reading had raised with me, in the cumulative sense of all the other issues that we were dealing with in Queen Elizabeth and with the background of NHS Highland, and a clear understanding that NHS Highland are not necessarily unique in their cultural challenges. It would be likely, although I cannot be definite, it would be likely that Professor McQueen would say one of the things we can do is ask his to conduct an unannounced inspection.
If we look back at your statement on page 103 of the statement bundle, in the middle of paragraph 24, it's about 10 lines down. You see it says, work to investigate this starts the line, and then I would defer to the CNO in relation to detail, but would observe that the results produced by HIS were quite shocking. What was it that was shocking about the report's conclusions?
So I think it was primarily that, on the one hand, what the inspectors were seeing was a high standard of infection prevention and control practice on the part of staff in the areas that they were inspecting, in terms of hand hygiene, appropriate use of PPE, appropriate use and disposal of blood samples, fluids, etc. But they were also finding serious problems and issues around the fabric of the building.
So, were those issues of fabric things that had been mentioned by Dr. Peters and Dr. Redding?
I don't believe in particular, no.
No. So in fact, they're finding more than, to some degree, obviously, you will take whatever they say as well their results, but you wouldn't have been surprised if they'd reported what Dr. Peters and Dr. Redding had told you, and now they're telling you other stuff.
Yes.
Right. I think we find that on page 1498 of the results of the report, of things that the Health Board could do better. So that's bundle 18, volume 2, page 1498. Paragraph 33. We also see paragraph 31, which is the bottom of the previous page. We were shown a clinician's report from 2017 that detailed 27 issues within the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and Institute of Neurosciences. We raised this with the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde's senior management. We were provided with an action plan for these issues. However, we're not assured actions have been taken to resolve these issues. Now, we're about to talk about the Cryptococcus meeting that you've already mentioned. When this report arrived in your office, were you at that point aware of the 27-point action plan?
No.
And if we go to page 1502, so that's 5 pages further on page 60, the next page, please. We also see detail about the absence of functioning negative pressure isolation rooms, paragraph 63. Again, is that something that had been drawn to your attention by those GDG officials who you'd met?
Why, sorry?
If you look at paragraph 63,
yes.
Senior management told us there were no functioning negative pressure isolation rooms in the hospital. Is that something that had been mentioned in the meeting about ventilation and Cryptococcus and the pigeons?
No. Excuse me. No, it had not. No.
So, to what extent did you see this report, amongst other things, as a confirmation of what the whistleblowers had told you?
To a significant extent. I mean, it did not. It did not touch on the issues they'd raised about the problems they had had, or they believed they had had in doing the job that they were there to do, with access to data and their concerns being actioned. But in other ways, it did validate other concerns that they had raised.
clearly there are recommendations in here. We just looked at 3 of them, but there are a lot more than that. Did you take an interest in whether the health board ultimately complied with these recommendations?
Yes.
And are you able to tell us if there was a point after this report got to you when you were satisfied they had implemented everything on the list?
No, there wasn't a point where I was satisfied. The work was underway, of course, but the pace was not sufficiently speedy enough for me. And of course, as you know, as we progressed through that year, we moved to a situation where the board is escalated in the NHS escalation framework.
So would I be right in inferring that by the time escalation happens, they still haven't done everything on the list? They may have done some of it.
Yes.
Right. Now, I want to move on to the cryptocurrency meeting you mentioned before. So this is paragraph 25 of your statement, page 104 of the statement bundle. Paragraph 26, actually, sorry. It's also covered in your Edinburgh statement to some degree, paragraph 34, the main one. You recall a meeting and you list in paragraph 26 some of the people who were there. So that's the chief executive, Ms. Grant, the chair, Professor Brown, the medical director, Dr. Armstrong, and Professor Steele, the new head of estates. Now, at whose initiative did this meeting take place?
Excuse me, at mine.
And did you tell them, in a sense, what you wanted it to address?
Yes, I wanted to. So this was, if you like, the latest in a line of a series of infections, stroke incidents at this hospital. So I wanted to understand what they were doing to identify how had this happened, how had apparently pigeon droppings found their way into the hospital in a way that then impacted on patients. But I also wanted to understand how well they were seeing the current cumulative situation in the round and were acting to address that.
I think it's probably fair to note that as of the day before yesterday, it was certainly the position of the health board that pigeon droppings didn't cause any impact to patients. Was that a view that was expressed to you at this meeting?
No, it wasn't. Remember this, and in fairness to them, this meeting was fairly early on after the infections had been identified, and it was at that point considered possible that this had come from a gap in the plant room at the top of the building where pigeons had got in, and that had then found its way through. It was subsequent work that suggested that was not the case.
And would that be the results of the Cryptococcus expert subgroup that
Yes.
we've heard about? That took some years to be produced.
Yes.
In fact, it may not even be produced before you left office.
I'm not sure if it was.
Right. And this meeting takes place in January before the independent review is set up.
Yes.
Did you tell them the independent review was coming at this meeting?
No.
Did you receive any assurances from them?
I did not feel assured when I left.
So thinking about your definition of assurance from earlier on, did you ask questions?
Yes, I did.
What sort of questions were you asking?
So I was asking in detail what their view overall was of the infection that they had been dealing with up to this point, the water, the bloodborne, now this. What was their thinking about why this was happening? And my impression was that they were dealing with each in a discrete manner and not seeing a cumulative impact. Nor were they particularly aware in a serious manner of what the impact of all of this might be on public confidence in the safety of the hospital.
So we just break that down a bit. Thinking about these discrete events as they were presenting them to you, clearly they haven't expressed to you a view on causation in respect to the latest cases, as you just said that. But if we think back to the water incident that was underway when you took office, and then the decant in September, did they express any view as to how it was those infections had come about?
No, what they told me was what they were doing about them. So what they were doing to secure an improved water supply, what they were doing by way of in-ward maintenance. I remember Mr. Steele, who was new in post, was clear about his concerns around the overall maintenance schedule and how jobs were being prioritised and so on, and his intention to improve on that. And for someone who was very new in post, he had a number of very specific actions he intended to take, about which I was assured. But what I was being otherwise told was what was being done to fix the problem, not what are we doing to understand why there is a problem.
Now, before I ask you the next question, I want to just attempt to ground again in documents we have. We have a HPS summary of the incident produced in December 2018, which is Bundle 7, Document 2, page 32. Now, there are a number of these, and you probably haven't seen this for some time, but I wondered if by the time you went to the meeting, if we look at this report, I'll just jump to the, in a sense, the conclusions in order to set the question up, which are not conclusions, the hypotheses, which is a much better way of putting it. They are page 45. This HPS report discusses the bottom of the page a number of different possibilities, one of which is ingress contamination, one of which is a regressional contamination over the page, and one is contamination installation. And it actually reaches the view in the previous page that it's B and C. I just wondered if before this meeting, whether you'd had been told or had the opportunity of reading this or received briefings that HPS felt this was possibly down to regressional contamination of the water system or contamination at installation, whether you had that level of knowledge at the point you mentioned.
I don't recall having that level of knowledge. What I do recall is a feeling which may have been based on this knowledge, but a feeling that there was something wrong with this building. You can't have this number of incidents and not feel something is wrong underneath all of this that we don't know and we don't understand.
So we can take that off the screen. Did you feel that your interlocutors from the health board were acknowledging a similar concern, or were they not thinking about that?
My feeling was that they weren't acknowledging that. They were dealing with the actions that they had taken, intended to take, in order to deal with the problems discreetly as they arose, the water problems, bloodborne, etc.
And I suppose to sort of wrap up this sequence of questions, I put this to you, did they tell you that the conclusions of the water incident team was that the cause of the infections in the first half of the year was contaminated water?
I believe they did.
They did, right. And you describe on the same page in your statement bundle, page 104. Well, actually, let's look at the broader concerns so we just stay grounded in all the detail. Paragraph 27, you recall from the meeting being surprised that the medical director, would that have been Dr. Armstrong,
Yes.
asked me why you were there and what
Yes.
the matter had to do with me.
Yes.
Are you sure that's what she said?
Yes.
Did you respond?
I believe I did. I am very sure that is what she said. Some things do stick with you. And I explained that I was the Cabinet Secretary for Health and I was responsible for and accountable to the public in Scotland on how our health service operated and delivered safe care. And that was why I was there.
Do you have any observation on whether it's a little bit unusual that you had to say that?
I think it's very unusual that I have to say it. I think by that I mean, I'm not saying that every time I meet senior or met senior members of an executive team in different health boards that they may not have thought that, but they never said it. And I think I was taken aback, not least because I was sitting with the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland and the DG for Health and Chief Executive of the NHS in Scotland. And I would have thought that that in and of itself would be a strong indicator to those present that we were taking these matters very seriously indeed.
Now, I'm not asking you to speak for all your predecessors, but if we think of the people who held office of Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, and before that in Minister for Social Care, and before that Parliamentary Under Secretary before the Parliament, was there anything unusual about, as it were, the three of you going to visit a health board like this, or is that something that happens relatively frequently, as far as you understood?
I don't believe it is a frequent or even relatively infrequent occurrence.
It's just one of these things that happen.
It's not one of those things that happens, because Cabinet Secretaries go and visit health boards, of course they do, and they go and visit hospitals and healthcare facilities. But you rarely have, and sometimes they are accompanied by the Director General as well, but you very rarely also have the Chief Medical Officer there.
Yeah.
So you have now brought the three most senior people from government to a board. I can only reflect that when I was the chair of a health board myself, I would have seen that as very serious indeed.
Is there anything that would have been more serious in terms of a bunch of visitors turning up?
I think possibly only if you had the First Minister involved.
Right. Now, I don't know whether you're being diplomatic or summarising, but I wonder if you can expand on the next sentence. You say you came away with the meeting with a general impression of surprise and concern about the guardedness and downplaying of the importance of the situation. Now, is that an impression gained from everything that was said? Just thinking back on it, it's sometimes you come out of a meeting and you think, well, if I look at the whole thing, that's the impression I might gain. Or is it actually that specific things were said, like, it's really not as serious as you think? And can you help me about which it is, or is it a mixture of the two?
So it's probably a mixture of the two. I think I called that meeting and I went to that meeting expecting the board to have a series of actions to put before me, to have in their tone of what they said, to be clear how serious they saw this, to raise asks of me about what they might need to help them. And I certainly expected them to understand the overall impact on the wider public. I did not see or hear any of that. And I did, as I say, came away additionally concerned on top of all the issues that we were dealing with as to whether or not this board and its senior team really understood the seriousness of what they were confronting.
Because this isn't the spring of 2018, this is January 2019.
Yes.
Do you want a moment to?
Yeah, fine, thank you.
So from your perspective, as a cabinet secretary and a politician, and before that, a special advisor and a chair of a health board, when something goes wrong or is perceived to go wrong in the institution, how would you expect an institution that's sort of on the ball to think about responding when they're challenged about their actions? What sort of processes would be going on in their collective minds about how to react in that sense of responding to a crisis?
Yeah, so I would expect them to seek to be on the front foot here. And once you get past the pleasantries of good mornings and what have you, to state clearly that they understand the seriousness of the situation, what they have done to try and initiate actions to identify what might have been going wrong in that particular instance, that they understand this then comes on the back of a series of incidents, and these are the actions that they intend to take, and to second guess what a cabinet secretary might additionally be concerned about, which would be, and how do the public see this?
Now, I'm going to suggest a couple of thoughts that might have occurred to you, but please, there may be others. It occurs to me one might think in such a situation that they don't have the skills. Equally, one might think they do have the skills, but they haven't realized it's significant enough that they need to use them. Or one might think they do have the skills, they've realized it's significant enough, but they don't want to act. There may be others in that territory. Can you break down your feeling of confidence or absence thereof, or level of assurance that you had when you left that meeting about the collective leadership that you just met?
As I said to you earlier, I was not assured when I left that meeting. I was additionally concerned, so I left with all the concerns that I had on the way in, with an additional one, which was, I'm not sure they really understand how serious this is. And I'm not sure why that's the case. Why do they not understand this?
I take it you probably said why you thought it was serious in the meeting.
Yes.
But you still had that concern at the end.
Yes.
At the end of the meeting, did you have a concern that they weren't capable of addressing the issue?
So capable is an interesting word. I did not have the concern that they were not capable in terms of having the necessary skills, intellectual capacity, or access to resources. But capable is also about attitude. And my impression was that there was a view that there was a degree of fuss about nothing, and that public confidence was not an overly important area to be concerned about, because they were doing A, B, and C, X, Y, and Z to address each of the discrete areas of difficulty, and not seeing the cumulative impact of that on their own staff, on patients, and on the wider public.
Can you help us by putting into context, I mean, you described how you had a meeting confidentially with Mr. Sarwar,
Yes.
who's not the same political party as you.
No.
At the time, was he an opposition spokesperson?
I think he was the opposition spokesperson on health, but he was also a Glasgow MSP.
No, I understand that, but it just, what I wanted to do is see if you could help us understand how significant these events were from the perspective of not only you as Cabinet Secretary in terms of public confidence, but Glasgow MSPs, the wider Parliament, professionals who take an interest in these things. We've obviously been through the whole pandemic since, and we've been used to, well, you appearing on the media regularly and that daily briefings, and it changes the way you think about things. If you go back to that point in early 19, can you help us understand, was there anything else in your portfolio, so that 6-month period, that was as significant?
At that point, obviously, NHS Highland was bubbling away. There were issues around. No, there isn't anything that was as significant as this, actually, because the other pressing issues, there had been the whole situation with respect to the use of mesh for women, and that had been, we were moving to resolve that. There were issues, of course, around waiting times, particularly for elective care, but the plan in place was beginning to show results. So there are always issues in the health portfolio, but it's less about whether there are issues and more about, are we beginning to see progress in any particular area? So this was at that point, I think it's fair to say, the most significant, because there was it did not feel to me at that point that we had a total grip of this.
One of the things you've explained actually more than once now in your evidence is that the issue around the meeting was to some extent related to the possibility of pigeon ingress into plant rooms. And I wanted to look at paragraph 29 on the next page, where we asked you specifically whether you had any recollection of being informed in late 18 or early 19, and it would have been very late 18, but early 19, where the rooms of the 2 patients who contacted Cryptococcus had benefited from HEPA filtration. Now, I suppose the follow-up question is, at that meeting, was there any acknowledgement that there was no HEPA filtration for the rooms those patients were accommodated in? If you can't remember, then you can't remember.
I can't recall. I would expect that to be the kind of question the CMO would ask, because she would be very well aware of the importance of these, but I can't recall whether she did or what might have been discussed on that.
Okay. In paragraph 30, I think you touched on this already. You discussed on Mr. Professor Steele discussing the maintenance rota and the things he wanted to do with maintenance, and you came away assured to some degree. If we think back to the HIS report, which you haven't yet got, which you're about to get, did that assurance remain in place once you read the contents of the Assure report about maintenance?
To an extent it did, because, for example, from memory, I think that the HIS reports talks about 300 outstanding maintenance issues. One of the things that Professor Steele spoke briefly about at the meeting that we're discussing was the importance of triaging maintenance requests in terms of level of importance. And I had a view that he understood the importance of the building fabric and infrastructure to infection prevention and control, and that some maintenance requests and requirements were more important for patient safety than others.
Thank you. I want to look at now the letter that was sent to Chief Executives by the DG Health on the 25th of January. So that's bundle 4, document 3 at page 8. At least I hope it's at page 8. Excuse me. Yes. So if we get our timings right, this has been sent 2 days, 3 days after the independent review's been announced. Week or so after a bit longer than you've met at the meeting in Glasgow?
Not much longer.
Not much longer. We can read it and we understand it amounts to a request to seek information on maintenance. This predates the HIS report, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Is there any particular reason why the focus is only on maintenance and not on asking health boards to confirm whether facilities, perhaps specialist facilities, are built in compliance with standards in SHTM 0301?
So I think the question in terms of was there a thought to extend the nature of the letter beyond what it covers is probably best addressed to Mr. Gray. I do recall a discussion with him, though, that says, so some of the maintenance that clearly is not getting done at the Queen Elizabeth is maintenance I would assume is being done. So can you double check that they're all doing it? And this letter comes from that.
Because at this point, you and your team do know that there are parts of the hospital that weren't built in with ventilation in compliance with the standards.
Yes.
And what we might explore after the coffee break is what happens next. But let's focus on the Schiehallion unit. It decanted 26th of September. We have the Innovative Design Solutions report about the ventilation in 2A in October. Can I take it that at the meeting with GGC, they're telling you about their plans for 2A to some degree? Presumably they're asking you for money.
I don't recall that they specifically asked for money, but
you at least know that they've got to think about upgrading that ward. Are they talking, and they've upgraded 4B already? We know that. Is there any talk, is the best way of putting it, about upgrading any other parts of the hospital in ventilation terms at this stage?
No.
No. Well, Lord, this might be a good place to break for our coffee break. There is a document I need to check before moving on to the next section.
Very well, we'll just do that. Ms. Freeman, can I ask you to be back for 11:45?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thanks, Dan.
Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you, Miller. Mr. Freeman, I just thought I'd go back to something you said earlier on. We were talking about accountability, and you, I think, accepted that you're accountable to the Parliament. Obviously, it's a very real public accountability. And then you explained that you thought that the board is accountable to the Cabinet Secretary. Now, obviously, it's a sample of one, but when you go to that meeting in January, would it be fair to say that they don't necessarily see themselves as accountable to you?
Yeah, I think that's entirely fair.
And I just wondered whether those senior officers see themselves as accountable to their board primarily and not to the Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I think that would be true.
Now, if that's the case, and that executive members of health boards think they're accountable to their board, and those board members are all appointed by, well, not all of them, but most of them are appointed by, to some degree, by the Cabinet Secretary or by local government, could it be the case that if not in reality, but in the heads of the members of health boards, they don't see themselves as really directly accountable to the Cabinet Secretary?
Excuse me. Yes, I think that is a fair proposition. I think so. I don't think we should be too narrow here. There is accountability in terms of, I don't know, your employment status, or in the case of a politician, your elected status. There's also accountability. So that's quite a formal thing. But there's also accountability more widely defined for your behaviour and your actions and your decisions. So I am not directly accountable to the Scottish public in a formal sense. I am accountable as Cabinet Secretary through the Parliament to them. I'm accountable to my constituents, and they exercise their judgment on that at election time. But there is a wider view of accountability, which is a sense of responsibility, regardless of employment status or any other formal situation, for what you do and the decisions that you take.
And I suppose that being at the risk of being overly legalistic about this, I wonder whether, if we stick with the formal accountability for a moment, there's a risk with a health board as a class of organisations that one confuses them with a local authority, where the members are accountable through the means of election. The health board, that's not the case, whatever it seems to imply in various parts of the Act. And so, can a health boards provide a proper level of scrutiny and accountability for their executive teams, given that they're not directly elected in the way that councils and the Parliament are?
I think they can, because I think whether or not you're a member of a health board appointed by a Cabinet Secretary or put forward by the relevant local authority, I think you have a responsibility to hold the executive members of that board accountable for the job that they are doing, and whether or not the actions that they take meet the overall direction for your board that has been set by Scottish Government.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to February 2019 and the arrival of Mr. Wright as your new DG.
Yes.
Now, he has explained in his statement, which it's paragraph 9 of his statement. We don't necessarily need to put it on the screen because it's a very short paragraph. he simply says, on coming into post, I had a number of initial conversations with you. And you spoke of your concerns about the Queen Elizabeth, the Children's Hospital, and the high priority we're giving them. And then he has a number of meetings. He gets a briefing from his predecessor. And he tells us that, of course, at that point, Greater Glasgow and Clyde was in stage 2 of the national framework. Is that your understanding?
That's right.
Had you put them there, or had they been there and since when you arrived?
I think they were there when I arrived.
I realise it's not your decision at that level of the framework. It's a lower down decision within the framework. So if we recap to where we are now, the independent review's been set up. You've done the HIS inspection. You've been to your meeting. The letter's gone out about maintenance from the GG. Mr. Wright's arrived, and we know they're at stage 2. What I've been asked to raise with you is the possibility that at that stage, you should have acted and taken them either to stage 3 or stage 4, but up within the framework. As to do so might well have prevented things that happened later in that year, particularly the breakdown of communications within the IPC team, but also would have resulted in oversight of the decisions around the closure of Ward 6A to new admissions to start earlier. And might have helped public confidence. So how do you respond to that suggestion that you could or should have acted in the way that you did later in the year, in February, March?
So first of all, I think it's fair to say that that is an entirely fair question, and I have reflected on that. As a caveat, it is not actually the Cabinet Secretary's decision whether or not a board is escalated or not. As you know, I think from Mr. Wright's evidence, but also from all the information you will have, that it is in fact the decision of the Director General as to whether or not, what level of escalation a board sits at. Undoubtedly, the Cabinet Secretary has a role in that decision. I think at that point, it was my view that we needed to continue to see how the board performed, having had that meeting in January, having had a follow-up discussion with Professor Brown and Ms. Grant, where I think my position was clear, and having instructed the independent review that it was at that point too early to move fairly to escalate them further.
You effectively wanted to see what happened now that various steps have been taken.
Yes.
Now, one of the things the inquiry's done is constructed a narrative of what happens. And so in March, we are not yet in the summer gram-negative infections in Ward 6A. That doesn't start, I think, until June. When do you become aware that there are new concerns or renewed concerns, depending on your point of view, about gram-negative infections in the Shahan unit, in its new home in Ward 6A?
Excuse me, I can't recall exactly when. I know that there is another, his report looking at data, but I don't recall the date of that or when I might have been informed.
I just wondered whether, if we can think of events on that journey, the closure of the ward to new admissions the 1st of August might have been something you'd have been briefed on.
I would have been briefed on that.
And then the next event after that is the 23rd of August, when the new chair of the IMT, Dr. Crichton, takes over from Dr. Inkster, who's been removed as the chair. And I wondered if, well, ARHI didn't know in advance, so I'm therefore assuming you didn't know in advance.
No.
No. But I wonder when you first learned of, as it were, change of personnel in the IPC team in late August 2019. Because you do meet Dr. Inkster early. Sorry, you don't. Sorry, Ms. McQueen meets Dr. Inkster early in September, and I wonder when you first learnt about these developments.
It would be at the point where the CNO
Right.
was advised of it, she would have told me.
Now, given all that had happened, so the independent review's been set up with a reference, with a remit that covers infectious HIAs and infection link, the meeting in January, Cryptococcus. Would you have expected GGC to have sought the advice of anyone else, whether that's RHI, the CNO, or anyone else in the centre, as it were, about the decision to remove the chair of an IMT whilst at stage 2, given the high level of government interest that the scrutiny they're under at the time?
I wouldn't necessarily have expected the board or GGC to ask the advice of, but I would expect them to have informed the CNO.
You ultimately met Dr. Inkster in December.
Mm-hmm.
And you just explained that you thought you would have been told about her removal by the chief nursing officer at least once they met. What impact, if any, did the news that the lead ICD had been removed and then resigned have on your views or concerns about the events in Glasgow?
Well, excuse me, well, they added to them. I wasn't obviously in a position to comment on, at that point, or indeed at any point, on the rights and wrongs of someone being removed from their position. But I was concerned that that had happened, and of course heard Dr. Inkster's view as to why that happened. And there seemed to me to be a repeat of a pattern which whistleblowers had expressed, which was if you keep raising concerns and challenging, you're considered to be a problem. And so you need to be moved on.
Thank you. I wanted to look at an update that you received in the form of a timeline, which I want to make sure I go to the page that's Glasgow, not Edinburgh at this point. So allow me just a moment to do that. This is the one that's referred to at the end of paragraph 32 of your statement on page 106. I think I'm going to, well, let's go to it. Let's check that it's the right document, because it maybe we've added the wrong document here. So it's bundle 52, volume 1, document 5, page 29. And it's an email from Mr. Wright to you. I get I'm wondering whether this might be actually a briefing about Edinburgh. So if we go to page 30, it's from January 2020. It looks to be largely a briefing about events in Edinburgh.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. So what I might just do is just double check. There was something I thought I'd noticed, but it may have been. Yes, page 32, paragraph 19. So obviously we're discussing in this context the Edinburgh Hospital's Haematology Oncology Service. But you'll see at 19, the service at the Royal Hospital for Sick Children supported the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Paediatric Service from August to December 2019 by taking patients while they were closed to new admissions. GGC was able to resume taking new patients in December 19. The additional workload was challenging at times, particularly for pharmacy colleagues, but managed overall well overall by the RHSC clinical team. So can I take from that whilst this closure to new admissions was going on in Glasgow, given that it affects 2 health boards, your team, if not you, would have been monitoring the
Yes.
closure?
Yes.
Thank you. The next section in your statement, back on statement page 106, is headed in our structure, retrofit at Queen Elizabeth and the Royal Hospital for Children. Now, I think what I need to do is attempt to, well, firstly, check your understanding. So you've set out your understanding of what the retrofits are. So Roman numeral 1, line 1, is Ward 2A and 2B. And then Roman numeral 2 appears to suggest, what's that? Individual room areas, including changes to sinks and where necessary showers in order to improve the water filtration system. I wonder if you can expand on what you understand by that.
Roman numeral 2.
2, yes, please.
So, from memory, what that refers to is where in individual rooms there needed to be changes to the taps or the shower heads or the sealants around shower areas in terms of water ingress and also the quality of water coming through the system.
To some extent, might that be connected to work that was done in Ward 6A in January that required a decant to CDU?
Yes, it may have been.
Right.
Yes.
So I want to ask you about a couple of other issues which aren't on this list, which is the adult haematology ward. So this is not Ward 4B, the bone marrow treatment ward, but the other haematology ward, where once we get into 2019, there is discussion involving the health and safety executive around that ward. But I'm wondering when and how the issues in 4C first came to your attention. And perhaps most importantly, who told you? Whether it's GGC or your own team?
It would be my team that told me.
Right.
Now, whether or not they had that information from GGC, I can't say, but it would be my own team who told me. Exactly when, I'm afraid I can't recall.
Now, there's another issue that's a bit related to it, and it's been quite low on our radar, so it's possible you weren't aware of it, which is issues around the ventilation in paediatric ICU on the first floor. Now, just for reference, which I'm not going to put on the screen, there is a correspondence in Bundle 12, documents 149 to 157, which is a correspondence between the Health Board and the Health and Safety Executive. But it seems to involve changes to that ventilation system and how it is operating. Were you aware of that issue on the first floor of the Children's Hospital?
Yes, I was.
Can you help us understand when that would have been?
I'm afraid I can't.
But it wouldn't have been in the first few months of 2019. It would have been later.
No.
And then you've already told us that you think you're aware of the general ward ventilation question in December, January, turn of the year 1819.
Yes.
Right. You discuss in your statement from this page the issue of retrofits, and you discuss it in evidence, and I'm just not going to go there, columns 45 to 47 of your previous transcript. What I want to do is look at paragraph 34 on the next page. You say you didn't receive any explanation from NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde why it had taken the length of time it had from the hospital opening to identify and put in hand changes to the patient environment unit in general, and specifically in its ventilation system. Are you sure about that?
I am.
Because we have had evidence that the issue was firstly on agendas of committees, Acute Services Committee in 2017, and it does look as if that Health Protection Scotland were involved in writing an SPAR for January 18. So the Health Board had been in discussion with HPS. So could it be that it, in a sense, it had got into the knowledge of the Scottish Government even before you arrived that there were issues around ventilation?
It may well have done.
And how would a health board find money to do a retrofit on something like Ward 2A? I mean, it was very expensive in the end, but how would they fund that?
They would either, I'd imagine, they would either look to see how they could use their existing capital allocation and reprioritise its use. Or if they wished additional funds, they would come to the finance section of the health portfolio. I'd also imagine if they wanted to reprioritise the use of the capital funds, they would at least need to inform the finance section
Well,
of the
that was
health
my
portfolio.
question, is that if you're going to restructure your capital programme
Yeah.
as a health board, you do need to tell the Scottish Health Department.
Yes.
Right. So would you be effectively saying that in order for them to do anything, whether it's to use the money they haven't got or reallocate money they have got, they've got to engage with the Scottish Government?
Yes, I believe so.
And did you ever, you say you didn't receive an explanation. Did you ever seek an explanation from them?
Yes, I did.
And when might that have been?
I can't be specific on when that would have been, but I think as I became increasingly aware of the situation around the ventilation in various parts of the hospitals, I would be asking, why has none of this been fixed up until now?
Because in at least your meeting in January, that is 3 months after they've issued a statement, which is of some controversy, in which they note they're going to take action on the ventilation system of the ward. And there is question about whether that is entirely frank, but the statement is issued. And so when that statement was issued, presumably, would you not have seen the statement or been briefed about the fact they were issuing statements
I
saying
would
they
have
were going
been
to do
briefed about the statement.
So in a sense, the issue of why haven't you done this before would have come to be important, possibly as early as October 18, certainly around the time they're making statements, we're going to do the work.
Yes.
And does that help you understand when you might have raised the issue with them?
It may well do, but as I say, I may well have raised the issue. I did not at any time receive an explanation as to why it had taken the length of time it did.
You mentioned in paragraph 35, where you're discussing retrofit, and you explain that you were concerned about the fact that changes were needed in the first place, nervous about whether retrofitting would meet the standards, given that these standards were not met initially. Can you expand on what you mean by that? It's a little gnomic.
About being nervous?
Yes, that sentence.
I think it's about confidence. It is about, if these standards weren't met in the first place, can we be absolutely sure they're going to meet them now?
Understand. And that's the context of the health board doing it.
Yes.
Is that a sort of concern about capacity, interest? How do we've had a conversation about where you got assurance when you met them in January. To apply the same question here, are you concerned about their ability or something else?
I think it was incomprehensible to me how the standard required was not met in the first place when the hospital was built. Why was that not? I think I said before in a previous appearance, I don't see the point of having a standard which is about patient safety and then blithely ignoring it. So I couldn't understand, why was this not right first time round? In the absence of an explanation as to why it was not right first time round, I think, reasonably nervous about whether or not, albeit might be different personnel, you're going to get it right this time round.
But you let them go on and do it because 2A was done under GGC's supervision, they'd started in a sense in
Yes.
2018?
Yes, of course, because it needed to be done.
Did you put in any forms of additional scrutiny or assurance around the 2A project at that stage? I mean, I recognise Assure comes down the track towards the end after you've retired, but in terms of trying to check them, did you put in any structures in 19 to check they're doing the 2A project properly?
Well, in 2019, at this point, we're getting pretty close to the escalation, and that brings all sorts of oversight and scrutiny to
Right.
what is happening.
So you see the escalation as the scrutiny, in a sense?
Yes, escalation to level 4 is certainly about scrutiny and oversight.
Now, one of the questions we've been asking and getting different answers for different wards is whether there were risk assessments done around different wards' ventilation systems. And we learn that there's never been a risk assessment done for the general wards, although there has been a risk assessment done for Ward 4C, for example. Was the question of whether there had been risk assessments something that was on your mind or your team's mind in that summer of 19, something that needed to be done?
Excuse me. It would not particularly be on my mind. It's a level, it's not unimportant, but it's a level of detail I would expect my team to be dealing with.
So it's not something that as a matter of reality crossed your agenda, as it were, at that
Not
time?
that I recall.
No. So given what you were saying about what you knew about ventilation when the decant happened, can you be, looking back on it, satisfied that the patients were moved to a suitable alternative environment when they were moved to a ward which might well have had, in fact, it had the same ventilation, but it's two different problems. So 2A outside the bone marrow treatment rooms has the same ventilation as 6A. But you and your team weren't aware of that at the time the decision was being made. So
I don't believe so, no.
does any issue arise about the level of scrutiny GGC put into the various different options they considered for decant?
I think it's possible with hindsight that does arise. I think it is likely that my team assumed that there was work undertaken to consider each of the options in terms of suitability for that patient cohort. But whether or not assurance was given on that, I can't comment.
So the next issue I want to raise with you is the question of, well, it's something that arises in paragraph 37. So it's on the next page. You're discussing here the possibility, you make inquiries, you describe, of the possibility of carrying out works for ventilation of the Queen Elizabeth RHC to bring them up to the required standard for a new build hospital. And you obviously rely on your advisors. And you remind us you're not personally an engineer. And you spoke frequently in the middle of the paragraph to the CNO and sought advice from HIS and NSS. And then the Oversight Board gave you advice. And there's a question of priority discussed at the bottom. And you say air change rates not meeting the standard across the hospital is not unimportant, but the priority had to be wards and rooms handling the most vulnerable patients, and whether adults or children, and consideration had to be given to the order of that, and that's reflected with the terms of reference. Now, we ask in the next question, well, I'm asked, you say, before leaving Office of Cabinet Secretary, why I did not order retrofit or remedial work to the ventilation system, or an investigation in how a step could be taken. And over the page, you explain why you felt a retrofit couldn't be done, because it's an active hospital. It's different from the Edinburgh experience. And I'm not going to press you further on that, but it's about the investigation. Why didn't you order, or indeed suggest to the Oversight Board or the Health Board, that they carry out an investigation of what it would take to retrofit, or a risk assessment of whether it was needed? Because one of the issues we're in is a slight information vacuum. The inquiry will have to make its own decisions. But there wasn't a systematic consideration of what it would take and whether it's necessary to retrofit the general wards, even as an investigation. I wonder why you didn't press for an investigation.
It's a very good question, and I really don't have a satisfactory answer to that. From my point of view, far less yours. I do not know why I did not ask that. It is an obvious ask to have made.
Could it, to some extent, be grounded in the sheer scale of such an investigation? Because it's 1,300 rooms, largest hospital in Scotland. One gets the impression that not only would it not be easy, it would not be cheap. Is there any possibility that you simply didn't really want to ask for fear of getting the answer?
No, I don't think so. I don't think I don't think I've ever been held back from asking because I'm afraid of the answer. I think it is, and I think your offer of an explanation is kind, but I think it is simply that I have no explanation as to why I did not ask. And I think that was a mistake.
Now, equally, we know that when Ward 2A was being refitted, after you had left, there was some form of process by which the ARG group, led by the Chief Nursing Officers, and other parts of Scottish Government and NSS attempted to have some assurance over whether that was built to the correct standards. And there's a debate about whether they did well enough, but there is at least some process. Given that 4B had been redone and had opened before you arrived, why not check back to make sure 4B has been done properly, given all the concerns you've expressed about the health board's, I don't quite mean reliability, but those sort of the lack of assurance you had? Why not look back at 4B and check it's been done right? Because it doesn't have full air changes. It doesn't have HEPA filtration in the corridor. And there's a debate about whether that matters. But from your perspective as the government coming in, asking all these questions, why not challenge about 4B as well?
Again, excuse me, I don't have a definite answer to that question. It could be that I assumed that my team would be asking that. And if there was a problem, that they would bring that to my attention. But I'm conscious that's not, if I was listening to myself, that is not a particularly satisfactory answer.
Yes, because you've just told me that that's not assurance.
Yes, that's right.
We've done this with other people, so we'll ought to do it with you at this point. How much of your time as Cabinet Secretary is being taken up with NHS Greater Glasgow by the time we get into September, October, November of 2019?
A significant amount.
Is it causing any difficulties with capacity for you and your team at that point? I'm conscious COVID is coming down the track, which will dwarf everything, but is it dominating to the extent it's excluding other things?
I don't believe it did, no.
What I want to do now is move on to NHS Scotland Assure. Now, you've covered that in some detail in your earlier statement for Edinburgh, the longer one, paragraph 151 to 158. And of course, that evidence was focused on, in simple terms, the problems that existed with the Edinburgh procurement. I don't want to revisit that. Paragraph 39 onwards of this statement, you discuss it here and you remind us that you didn't actually set it up, you just suggested it in simple terms. I want to perhaps remind you of a couple of things you said and then put some things to you. So in your transcript, I have noted that you saw it as an attempt to walk this is column 34, attempt to walk the tightrope between the positions of health boards in terms of their legal standing and statute and the responsibilities in the Scottish Government and Cabinet Secretary. Is that reference back to this discussion about accountability we previously had?
To a degree, yes.
But also to do it without throwing up in the air the legislation that underpins health boards. Is that the act that creates them as an independent body?
Yes.
Right. And you talked at column 78 about the idea of having a clerk of work, someone walking around with a clipboard.
Yes.
Can you expand? I mean, Edinburgh would have been looking at spreadsheets, but in this context, what would you imagine this clerk of work is doing in the context of the Glasgow hospital?
So the phrase clerk of works comes from the situation in the Edinburgh hospital, where the difficulty with the ventilation system in the particular areas that were critical came to the attention of the health board and therefore from there to Scottish Government and to me at the last minute when someone went to physically check the air change rate. Up until that point, it had been a paper exercise. And that's, from that is when I said, we can't do this on the basis of a paper exercise. We actually need, and my phrase was, I want a clerk of works. I want the equivalent of the guy that wanders around with a clipboard, switching things on and off to check that they actually do work. And they're working in the way in which we require them to work. And from that came the proposition of what is now NHS Assure. In other words, that you don't satisfy yourself that standards, the required standards that link directly to patient safety, on whatever aspect of the build you're talking about, have been met on the basis that you have the relevant bits of paper to say they have been met. At some point, somebody has to go and physically check that that's the case.
The reason I mentioned that example is because whilst in the Glasgow hospital, there wasn't a clerk of works, well, what there was an NEC3 supervisor role performed by Capita. And one of their staff gave evidence, and we looked at their contract, and they were going around physically checking that things were built in accordance with the drawings. And therefore, they weren't looking at whether they were built in accordance with the contract. But even if they had been looking at whether things were built in accordance with the contract, they wouldn't have found the problem because it was embedded in the contract. And I suppose what I'm asking is, to what extent did you imagine when you were thinking the thoughts that became NHS Assure, that the problem wouldn't be someone making a mistake in the process of turning contract into building, it might be actually embedded into the contract itself?
Both.
Right.
Both. I think that we cannot continue with an assumption that the commissioning and the design that then follows that, and construction that then follows that, will without question and without checking, cover all relevant standards that pertain to patient safety. You need to be sure of that, because if you don't get, it's like anything else, if you don't get the commissioning right, then at some point down the line, you're going to have to retrofit and fix that. And that inevitably, it costs more money, but more importantly, in a situation like a healthcare facility, you have increased risk in the exercise.
So returning to, we have not, this inquiry, of course, has not reached conclusions, but we've issued various preliminary position papers. And one of them, PPP 13, sets out this position, which is that, and I think it's been confirmed in evidence, just to a great degree, that a matter of days before contract close on the 18th December 2009, the final issue of an inconsistency between the proposal by the tenderer, Brookfield Europe, and the employer's requirements set out by the health board was resolved. And that inconsistency was that the requirements required compliance with the guidance in draft of that form, SHTMO 301, but they also required a maximum temperature in the building of 26 degrees, when the guidance requires 28. And Brookfield Europe's bid did that by the use of chilled beams and a low air change rate. And that was resolved a matter of days before in negotiations. Now, how did your vision, would your vision of NHS Assure have spotted something like that in the last few days of choosing a tenderer? Not the building of it, the full business case, or even the choice of outline business case, but that final moment when it's all getting quite busy.
That is where I would want NHS Assure to be. I think that requires different expertise than perhaps NHS Assure currently has. Because at that point, as I would understand it, and I am no expert at all in this regard, but I would think at that point, as in any contract, then you require a degree of legal advice as to whether or not what you're negotiating is up to what you want.
I think it's fair to say that NHS Greater Glasgow did have legal advice.
Right?
I'm wondering about, well, firstly, let's talk about NHS Assure as it is now. Did you have the opportunity of watching or at least reading a summary of Miss Critchley's evidence?
I read a summary.
Just before we came in, you mentioned you had some thoughts about the way she had described the organisation that she now leads.
Yes.
Can you help me what that might be?
So, and this is only from reading the transcription. As you know, I stood down in 21, so I am not able to comment on how NHS Assure has been set up and what it is doing. But in her evidence, I understood her to say that the organisation was there to work in collaboration with health boards and to provide support, to be supportive. I wouldn't disagree with either of those two propositions, but I have a concern that organisations can be overly supportive when what we need them to do is to set out clear red lines that the organisations they're working with are required to meet. So that's my, if you like, my niggle, that you can take support too far. It's like when people fear that you can't be challenging in holding a board or whoever to account if you're also to be supportive. I think it is entirely possible to be both. So my only concern from that transcript, which may be unfounded in truth, and I'd accept that, is that NHS Assure is not being as firm in what it requires from boards as I had envisaged it might be.
How would you respond to the suggestion that rather in the way that in a large development project, the funder, a bank or investment fund, would put its own lawyers into the negotiations to make sure the contract met its requirements,
Yeah.
in addition to the landlord or the tenant, that the Scottish Government, in the biggest, and I don't just mean that important GP practice, but a large tens, hundreds of millions of pound project, in the biggest projects, should put its own, and presumably you have to get these in from outside, its own team of construction lawyers into the negotiations to make sure that slip-ups, or mistakes, or errors that might have big impacts on the long-term viability of the building don't happen. However, it might be rather expensive. These lawyers are not cheap.
I think that is a perfectly valid proposition that should be given consideration. I can see full well why that is reasonable to do. And the point about cost, you have to balance the cost of providing that degree of assurance at the very early stage with the potential cost of having to fix problems down the line, not just financial cost, but cost to patients, their families, and the wider public.
Thank you. So I've been asked to ask you a couple of questions. The first one is, who should a patient or group of patients go to escalate matters in the event of a failure by an NHS board to comply with Scottish Government guidance? In this case, it is the air change rates in Ward 4B, but there may be others. What should someone do when they learn this? If they're a patient or patient group, because clinicians can raise it internally and hopefully through whistleblowing, but how would a patient act? What should they do?
I think in the first instance, the patient or their families would raise that directly with the chair of the board. If they were dissatisfied, felt they hadn't been given a full answer, or that they were dissatisfied with the answer or believed they didn't get one, they have three options, I think. One is the Public Service Ombudsman, who will hear those kind of concerns. I believe we now have a Patient Safety Commissioner for Scotland, so that would appear to be a direct route. And the third option, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, is whoever is in post as the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. The other one is Ms. Critchley, I think, gave evidence that she and her organisation see HIS as a regulator for health boards. Now, maybe that was a quick answer, but is that correct? And if it isn't, do you need a regulator for the NHS in Scotland, rather like Monitor down south?
I don't believe that HIS is a regulator. Now, do we need one for the NHS? Possibly, I think. And I only say possibly because I don't think it is wise to rule it out. I think it is wise to give it proper due consideration and see how such a regulator might operate alongside other regulators that are part of the health landscape. For example, the GMC, other regulators in terms of the professions inside the NHS. But I think it is worthy of due proper consideration.
Thank you. Now, I'm just going to check with mine. Can we move on, I think, to the topic of duty of candour, which you covered from paragraph 43. You explain on page 111 that families had no criticism for the staff because the staff had no knowledge of what was going on. I can just check, in this context, this is families largely through the Saheli unit?
Yes.
Yes. and therefore the families were doubly cross about not being told what was happening, but also that their clinicians were not being able to answer questions. Now, you then say the meetings highlighted to me that the board was failing in their organisational duty of candour, and that individual clinicians were being hampered in their exercise of the individual duty of candour as a result of not being provided with relevant information. Now, what I wanted to do was to sort of break this down, because we've obviously heard about the organisational duty of candour under the 2016 Act, and we've heard about the individual duty of candour which exists within the medical professional regulatory system. And I don't think anything arises about your reference to the individual duty of candour. But with the organisational duty of candour, are you thinking about individual patients not having appropriate organisational duty of candour carried out for them? Is that what you're trying to point at?
It is individual patients, and it's also a number of individual patients. So it is the wider group. So I met that group of families, and in families of young patients, but also including some young patients, as I explained, I think, earlier. I met them with the Chief Nursing Officer and heard from them their concerns, their attempts at finding out what was happening, why there was a decant, why things were being done to sinks and showers, all of that. And that they were getting nowhere. They were not getting any answers. And they're upset that the staff that they were receiving, or their relatives were receiving care from, were themselves upset because they could not provide them with those answers too. And they were very, very clear that they had no criticism whatsoever of any of the clinicians, nursing staff, housekeepers, porters, anyone that they were in contact with and were providing care and support to them. That was not where their criticism lay. I then, as I say, also met individual families who did not want to be part of that bigger group meeting, and heard the same thing from them. So it was clear to me that those individuals I was hearing from, that the statutory duty of candour was not being met, but it was also not being met to that group as a group.
Well, that's what I wanted to just try and break down two parts of it. So we stay with the statutory duty of candour for a moment. We know from Professor White's evidence and the meetings of his subgroup of the Oversight Board that he had some concerns about the GGC policy on statutory duty of candour and whether it was compliant. You're familiar with that?
Yes.
Yeah. And it was subsequently changed. Now, when asked about what she thought about the fact that the board was operating a non-compliant duty of candour policy, Ms. Grant's position was that to some extent that should be seen in the light of the fact that legislation was new and that their policy had been looked at by other health boards, indeed might have been used by others to some degree, she felt, and therefore it wasn't really a breach of the policy, of the statutory policy, to follow their policy as it was set out at the time, because they'd effectively done their best to do it right. How do you feel about that?
I think that is an inadequate explanation of not having a policy that is compliant with your statutory duty.
Could more have been done to explain these policies to health boards?
I think I don't know. I've not seen the transcript of his evidence or his witness statement, but I think Professor White would rightly argue that a great deal was done to explain exactly what the statutory duty meant to health boards on more than one occasion, including in the bringing together of the legislation, the passage of the legislation through the Scottish Parliament, and then the final act and how that was to be implemented.
So the other thing you talked about was a duty of candour to a group.
Mm.
And when I read the legislation, I see it triggered by a concern expressed about an outcome on an individual patient by a registered medical practitioner. Is that roughly your
Yes.
understanding? So to what extent, so would it be fair to say, therefore, that there is no statutory duty of candour to a group? So that if there are a group of parents with a group of patients in a unit, if one patient has an outcome that triggers the policy, they should receive a duty of candour declaration and the appropriate steps as per the Act. But the duty of candour legislation, does it really provide any requirement to provide information to the rest of the community?
No, and when I use the phrase group, I simply meant there was a lot of individuals.
Right.
There was a large number of them, and they were described to me as a situation. They were described to me by the board as a situation where the majority of patients and their families did not have concerns. This was a particular Facebook group that was troublesome.
From where in the board did that come?
It was actually said to me at one of the board meetings I attended.
The actual formal meetings?
Yeah. It was also reported to me by the chief nursing officer, and something that was said to her by one of the executive board members. So it's all part of this view that there isn't really a huge problem here and people are being difficult. I have rarely had, in all the time that I have been Cabinet Secretary, I do not think I have had another meeting that had quite the impact that meeting with families had on me, because they were asking questions for which they were perfectly entitled to the answers and were not being given those answers.
And just to take a step back, because it's quite striking. At a board meeting, which would be attended by the 30 or so members of the health board, somebody described the family group with whom you had met as a particular Facebook group, which was troublesome.
Yes.
So whoever made that statement, it was heard by every other board member. Did you pick up any challenge from anybody in the room to that proposition?
The only challenge I recall is from me.
Right. Thank you.
And when would this meeting have taken place?
I think it would be in 2019, and it may have been at the point prior to the escalation.
So time in the late summer, early autumn?
Yes.
After the meeting in January around the Cryptococcus case with the executive members?
Yes.
After the independent review?
Yes. And there was a Facebook group.
Well, indeed, we've got copies of its communications. I'm just trying to understand. I'm not going to use you as an expert witness, because I think the idea of being an expert politician is a dangerous concept. But
I would agree.
Did you attempt to rationalize or understand in your mind and think about how someone could have got themselves into that position after more than a year since the water incident started, to see that Facebook as a few troublesome people?
I think for me it was part of a pattern, which I think earlier you said it was diplomatic. I described as guarded and defensive. I think that was a general pattern of attitude from which flowed behaviour that came from the board and the senior team at Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
And you do see this as wider than just the corporate management team and the executive board members
Yes.
at the top, to include the non-executives as well?
Yes, I think so, yes.
We haven't taken statements from non-executive. We've spoken to two. And we haven't said it was Mr. Lee and Mr. Winter. We haven't covered this issue with them. So we haven't heard from their perspective.
Mm.
Apart from going to stage 5, do you have any steps you can take, I suppose, with a small p politically, to react to when a board has the attitude you're describing? What else can you do other than go to stage 5?
The chair and some of the non-executives are appointed by the Cabinet Secretary. So it is possible to consider the continuation of that appointment. That is something a Cabinet Secretary can do. In addition, though, as you know, in this instance, Professor White was tasked with the role of being the direct point of contact with those families and providing the information so that they could get the answers to the questions that they were legitimately asking. And in doing so, it was hoped that the board and the teams working to the board would improve their communication and the transparency of the information they were providing.
So in a sense, you took practical steps rather than dealing with the board members. It was about dealing with the issue.
Yes.
Would you accept that the adding of Professor White, to some extent, as the middleman in the process, may actually have had the effect of slowing down effective communication?
No, not at all. Not at all. I think what he did by his actions, by his understanding, and by his behaviour is he began the process of regaining trust from those families concerned and providing the information necessary to a wider group of relatives and patients who may not have been present when I met them on the 28th of September.
Ah, that gives you the date. Right. Now, let's turn to the process of escalation.
Yeah.
What at the time, if we know when you escalated?
Sorry, just so that I can pick up on that. The 25th of September date.
28th of September is
when
the
you
date.
met the families.
Yes.
Sorry, 28th.
28th of September is when I met a group of families, including some young patients. I think the 1st of October is when I met 2 families separately.
Thank you.
And would the meeting with the board have occurred after those meetings?
I can't recall.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask one of my colleagues before the lunch break to just walk through our board meetings. And no doubt there'll be a minute saying you were there. So we'll find out which one it is and I'll put it to you just after lunch.
Okay.
However, at the stage you're heading towards escalation, I want to understand what you felt before the lunch break, were the main barriers that you felt existed to effective resolution of the issues that you are now aware of by the time you get to September, October of 2019. So can we help us what you think the main barriers to resolving these issues were?
So I think I was still not seeing from the senior team an understanding of the issues as a whole, as opposed to discrete elements. I was not seeing from the senior team a significant willingness to look for additional support and external support from Scottish Government or elsewhere. And we had, as I expressed, a pattern that continued of what I perceive to be guardedness and defensiveness from that senior team and the board overall. And a lack of appreciation as to how all of this was impacting on confidence, public confidence, but also how a lowering of public confidence in a hospital impacts itself on the staff in that hospital.
Now, I want to just check we've got some chronology right. So the next page, paragraph 45, you start with, admittedly this is in a section entitled Whistleblowing, and you've moved into Duty of Candour. Around this point in time, I appointed Professor Marion Bain as new medical director with IPC. That would have been after stage 4 was escalated.
Yes.
Yes, so that's fine. And so it's worth, I think, just bringing in some names and characters that we'll deal with after lunch, as it were. So we'll come back to Miss Bain's appointment later, but then you appointed Callum Campbell to assist as turnaround director. Now, is he ultimately going to be a player in the program oversight group as opposed to the oversight board? The sort of second oversight board.
So Mr. Campbell, and my apologies, it's not as clear as it could have been in my statement. Mr. Campbell is appointed following the escalation of the board in full.
Yes.
To level 4.
And so he is, to some extent, and we'll discuss the differences, the equivalent of Professor McQueen for the whole escalation. Or have I got that wrong?
Yes, no, he's not. So the first escalation of the board to level 4 is around infection prevention and control.
Yes.
And that is then the creation of the oversight board chaired by Professor McQueen, the appointment of Professor Bain as the medical director who will deal with infection prevention and control. Subsequent to that, as a result of the board's performance in other areas, and I think you have sight of the position paper from John Conahan, who was the Chief Operating Officer for NHS Scotland. So performance in other areas, not released, waiting times and other matters. The board is escalated in total to level 4.
But with a different structure.
Yes, and that carries its own oversight board on performance.
Which is the performance oversight group.
Yes, that is chaired by Mr. Conahan.
Yes.
And Mr. Campbell is appointed as what's called the turnaround director. In other words, he is responsible for making sure that the plan to improve performance in areas of, for example, elective care is delivered.
So to some extent, and I appreciate this is a very loose analogy, he is the Professor Bain of the other oversight board.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I think it would be a good idea if we look at these two letters from Mr. Wright escalating, and we talk about those after lunch.
All right. Well, we'll take our lunch break now, and could I ask you to be back for 2 o'clock?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stand.